My dad was born in Salt Lake City. He lived in the Avenues and grew up there. Radio was in its infancy.
And even as a young boy, on Saturday afternoons, he would listen to the New York Metropolitan Opera with his parents around a little old radio.
All of my ancestors were pioneers who landed in Salt Lake City, so they had all of their family there. My dad was very close with his cousins. They were almost like siblings to him. They grew up around him.
And one day he and his friend were at the playground and there was this big pile of dirt, and lo and behold, found something in there, dig it, and they pull it out, and it's a cloth bag, and they're so excited, and they open it up, and it's full of money, a lot of money. They finally were able to find a janitor at the school, and they told him about, showed him what they found. And later it was discovered there was a bank robbery, and evidently these bills matched the ones that were missing. And the following morning, they had a special assembly at the school honoring my dad and his friend for their honesty. And I'm sure even though that was a really difficult time for my dad's family, would never have even crossed his mind to keep that money. Just, he was a man of integrity from a very early age.
He went to Lowell Elementary School from kindergarten through 7th grade. He said he was the teacher's pet in all of his classes. When he went to junior high school, Bryant Junior High School, he said he was the best student at arithmetic, the fastest reader, the best basketball player, and the editor of the school newspaper.
In his writing, he called these the halcyon days. And of course, then it was all disrupted by the Depression and war, and their family went from extraordinarily successful to, really poor.
And then some difficult things happened. His older brother Irvin, who I believe was the second oldest, died when he was a student at the University of Utah. He was kind of the apple of his father's eye, and suddenly he was gone. And that was a real blow that grandfather Wilson had a very difficult time dealing with. My dad's father also lost his job around that time. His wife had a serious heart ailment that developed that kept her bedridden for most of the rest of her life.
Dad grew up in Salt Lake City, and he cherished his mother. She taught him how to cook, how to put up jam and jelly, make bread and pies, and she taught him a lot about her family and helped him build self-confidence that really carried him throughout his life.
My dad had a very poor relationship with his father at that time in his life because he would see his father spending money on drink when it was needed to fund things at home.
He tells the story of going out with his dad in search of demon rum during Prohibition, that his dad knew the spots.
And so there was a lot of resentment and a very difficult relationship. One of the people who was very important in his life, and perhaps as important as his parents, was his Aunt Bay. Bathsheba was her full name, but she was known as Aunt Bay. She was a big influence in my dad's life. She provided a lot of guidance. I think when his father wasn't able to do that to the same extent. In fact, when his brother Paul's daughter died, Aunt Bay called my dad and told him there was a ticket so he could be there at the funeral of Judine, who was the small child of theirs. I think she was about 5 years old, who had died of leukemia.
I mean, you kind of start to see this transition in his life, and from this active childhood, you get this teenagehood it got a little more angst. And how he dealt with it was, I think in some ways, he worked a lot. He worked 2 days a week, 5 to 11 at the soda shop downtown, and then every weekend.
Well, I think he took an extra year to get through high school because he was skipping a lot of classes, not doing a lot of homework, and kind of in a rebellious state, which I think reflected his poor relationship with his father and the difficulties at home. I think he had a lot of reasons for acting out in high school.
You kind of have these two forces in his childhood, this really early part of his childhood that was, all this love, all this extended family, these halcyon days, and then later in high school, a little bit of this kind of disconnectedness. Dad really never went to church. He had no encouragement from his father. Dad jokes about the fact that his father would mow the lawn on Sundays to kind of get under the skin of neighbors, J. Reuben Clark and George Albert Smith.
After he graduated from high school, I'm not sure if he began at the U, but not long after, he enlisted in Uncle Sam's Army, as he used to call it.
Well, so Dad was, of course, excited to serve in the military. It's kind of funny to us in our day, there's not many that are excited to serve in the military. But, they really viewed this, the greatest generation, it was a moral war, and they viewed it as a responsibility.
And when Dad went off to the military, he ended up in an area close to his oldest brother, who was 17 years older, Stan, who I'm named after. And he really helped my dad understand how dramatic their growing up periods were different. So Uncle Stan had a very fine relationship with his dad, where my dad had almost no relationship because of the circumstances of the Depression.
So Dad landed in Normandy about 30 days following the initial invasion, and he was following behind artillery companies and tank companies, helping with the repair and the maintenance of that equipment.
So my father served in the same areas that I did on my mission. While he was in World War II, I was in northern France and Belgium, and he spent a whole bunch of his time in that northern France, getting over into Belgium, spent a whole bunch of time in Belgium. What he did was he was a mechanic, if you can believe that. He maintained rifles, and for those of you who knew him, the skills I have as a mechanic and my brothers, none of us are capable of doing anything mechanical.
But like many in the greatest generation, Dad did not talk very much about the war. Dad came over in 1994 to celebrate, we were living in Paris at the time, and we went from Paris up to Normandy. And, he had only heard about Normandy. He had actually never been there.
Dad arrived in Rouen, France, several weeks after the initial group of people that came to Normandy. So he was not on Omaha Beach. And Rouen, actually, there's a river that you go up once you've left the English Channel to get into Rouen. And that put them much closer to the battle, and the battle had already been won.
And we went to Omaha Beach, and Omaha Beach is a sacred place for anybody. And Dad was just kind of breathlessly, I was here, I went here. Oh, there's the Battle of the Bulge. Dad was at Battle of the Bulge, made famous in the John Wayne movie. And then you go through this kind of wall of cedars, and at that point you're above all the white crosses and white Star of Davids, where all the GIs are buried that gave their life at Omaha Beach, and he was just overcome.
To be able to go and experience those places with somebody who had been there and had friends that were part of that and just had lived it made it so real for me. And it was very apparent that he loved his country and that he was willing to sacrifice.
They marched through France, Belgium, and into Germany. At Christmas time, he talks about an experience he had in Germany. And this was really the beginning of his spiritual journey. And I'd like to read it from his personal history because it is just so beautifully stated and so powerful. He said, by Christmas, this is Christmas of 1945, we were getting many rumors regarding our trip home. Alas, none of them materialized. On Christmas Eve, 1945, we went to the next door American Red Cross station to sing carols. It was a bitter cold night, and several inches of snow were on the ground. After the caroling, several of us planned to go to the midnight mass at the little country church cathedral nearby. As we walked there, we could hear the church bells chiming out their carols. The heavens were black and deep and clear, and filled with millions of twinkling stars. And there was peace, the first peace in Europe in many years. My heart was full. I choked with emotion. There, for the first time in my life, I had some positive thoughts about a God in heaven, that there was a Christ whose birthday we were celebrating. I just knew that he loved me, that he wanted me to turn to him. It was all very evident that night. However, it took 10 years for me to bring those feelings to fruition.
But he recognized in that, one of his deepest and most profound spiritual experiences. And he knew for the first time that God was real, that despite all this turmoil, and you kind of think about it, a lot of people can't go through that without thinking, where is God? But at the same time, Dad goes through it. And, I think it's a testimony to his optimism and, to his outlook on life, that there he is. Freedom's happened, and these were evil things that occurred, but there is a God, and he felt that connection really for the first time in his life during the war.
When my mom was attending the U, she often spoke of how there were no young men there. They were all off serving in World War II.
When Dad returned from the war, he was eager to move on with his life because it had been delayed by 4 years in the military. So he went through the University of Utah in 2.5 years and really compressed what he was doing into a short period of time. He had some wonderful associations there. One of the stories he told me about his experiences there was in a marketing class.
He was sitting in class one day, and his friend came in, sat down beside him, and turned to him and said, "You'll never believe what happened to me yesterday." And my dad says, "What?" And he said, "I was made a bishop," and that was Tommy Monson.
My dad talks about meeting my mother and says he thinks he fell in love with her on the first date. And he says she could play the piano with dispatch and authority. That was his phrase, dispatch and authority. My mother was a phenomenal pianist. She played the things that were being played in the concert halls, and it was remarkable to hear her play. It was one of the great joys of my life to have her play the piano and listen to her. And my father was clearly mesmerized by this incredibly talented, beautiful woman that he met after he came home from the war.
My mom was born in 1927, 4 years after my dad. And she grew up right in the heart of Salt Lake, just a few miles from where my dad lived. And what was interesting is that she was a great-granddaughter of Brigham Young, but was not involved in the church at all. We don't have a great record of what her youth looked like, but it's very clear she was a very happy child, very driven by music, and enjoyed playing the piano at a very young age.
My mom had an older sister, Bonnie Jean, who died just before her 17th birthday. Bonnie Jean had what my mom called a creeping paralysis. My grandparents were very devoted in taking care of Bonnie Jean. And so my mom had this daily hands-on example just right in front of her of how to care for those who have really great needs. Bonnie Jean, for the last 3 years, couldn't feed herself. My grandmother lifted her everywhere she went, or my grandfather. Grandmother lifted her to take her to the bathroom. I know it was a difficult situation. And my mom loved her mother and her father. I've heard her say many times, and multiple people say, that my mom's father was the sweetest man in the entire Salt Lake Valley. Was a very sweet, loving man. And my grandmother was really the fireball in that relationship.
Her father was so loving and kind that her mother had to do a lot of the disciplining.
So Grandma Faye would always say, Janet sings and plays the organ, Dow Jr. plays clarinet, Ida plays piano, Dow Sr. plays percussion, and I play persuasion. And that great discipline, my mom, I was reading recently some material where she says, I could have practiced 8 hours a day. She just loved playing. And it was a gift.
So Mom loved languages at a very young age. So in 7th and 8th grade, she started taking French. And she tells a story of when she finished the 8th grade, that there was a conflict between the United States and France. And so all of Salt Lake stopped teaching the French language during her 9th grade year. So she decided that she was going to take Spanish. So she took Spanish her 9th grade year, and then after that, the conflict, whatever conflict it was, got resolved, and she went back to French, which was the elite language in our family for sure. 4 of the 5 children ended up speaking quite a bit of French.
So after my mom finished her piano lessons with Aunt Lyle, I think from there she started lessons at the U. She took from Grant Johansson. And she would tell us about how she would sit on the floor in the hallway outside his studio, waiting for her lesson, and she would memorize music while she would sit there.
Engaged. She actually, I read today, she graduated from East High School in Salt Lake at age 16. And then she went to the U for 4 years and got that music degree.
She had her college degree in piano. You know, I mean, what woman at that age, you know, whatever year grandma was born in, had a college degree?
Our mother was very musical. She had her degree in music from University of Utah. And my family forgets how athletic she was. She told me in elementary school that she was the team captain of volleyball and basketball, and she was the citywide jump rope and hopscotch champion.
My mother's father was Dow Young, and his father was Hiram Smith Young. So Hiram Smith, by the way, was Brigham Young's son. Everyone always wants to know how that tie-in goes. What was curious to my siblings and I growing up is that my mother was not a member of the church. My mom would always tell us about when she would stand on the corner to wait for the bus to go up to the U. She graduated from high school. Actually, she went through high school rather quickly, graduated at age 16, and went to the U. And sometimes when they were standing on the corner, she said that George Albert Smith would stop and pick up she and her friends and drive them up to the U.
Oh yeah, she had been studying seriously at the University of Utah with this William Peterson. He's quite well known. And she got offered a scholarship and she turned it down because she and George got engaged. And then my grandmother, Faye, thought Ida was too young at first to get married, so she made them wait a year.
I think one of the reasons my grandma wanted my mom to wait a year is because she had a lot of things she needed to do for that wedding. To have a fitting wedding for a Salt Lake City girl. Over the period of the next year, my great aunt Neil, who was my grandma's sister, went over to Europe, bought some Belgian lace and brought it home. There was very special satin that was used, and my grandma was a phenomenal seamstress. She made this beautiful wedding dress, really beautiful. When my sister and I got married, we both wanted to wear it. We both got married the same summer, and both of us wore that wedding dress. And then happily, I have a couple of nieces who've incorporated part of that dress into their wedding dress.
My dad graduated, got his degree in marketing from the U, and he got this job offer.
My dad received a job offer from the Paul Roberts Company that looked intriguing to him. It involved the industrial distribution business, and they were looking for a salesperson.
For a while, it had a temporary assignment in Twin Falls, and they knew Ida was musical. So they found his sister Meryl to show my mom a few things about the organ, because they knew she played piano. And in the church, we know that many pianists become organists. So she did, and she started to love it. She said she could get into the building and practice.
Remarkably, all 16 of my great-great-grandparents were Mormon pioneers. But somehow between them and my mother, the Young family, that branch of the Young family had drifted from the gospel path.
She was out in Utah visiting her sister, and I was at college. So my roommate and I met her at her sister's house, and we rode the tracks up to Salt Lake. And it was probably a 30 or 40 minute ride to wherever we were going. And this roommate I had is a really good listener. And she just starts pounding grandma with all these questions. And she ends up ultimately getting my grandma to tell her kind of her life story, but specifically she focused on her conversion to the church and how that all went down. And grandma was just so nonchalant about all of it, as if it wasn't this huge, massive family-changing event that took place, that she was literally the link that kind of changed it all.
She took the missionary lessons. She accepted the message and was baptized.
I just remember thinking, I'm not sure she even has a sense for the grandness of what happened.
My dad followed her a couple of years later. He started attending church, listening to the messages. He had been baptized as a boy and had some activity until his teenage years, then was inactive through the war years and beyond. And once my mother joined the church, which he fully supported, and she and he were very clear about the importance of his support in her decision.
1958, George gave a talk in church. I was away from the church for 22 years and then suddenly found myself the object of the loving efforts of many people trying to show me the truthfulness, the beauty, and enduring and eternal qualities of the gospel. Why, I asked myself, are these people so interested in me? Why is a man like Grant Brower so willing to spend so many hours and so much thought in showing me all these things? Why should he care about me? One of the reasons I am standing in the pulpit today is because the brightness of the light that radiated around Grant and his family. I know it is embarrassing to Grant to have me praise him publicly, but I and my dear wife Ida and our children will be eternally grateful to him for helping us show the way to family exaltation. We must, of course, live up to the Lord's commandments to do so.
So he starts going, and he was baptized as a member in the tabernacle, in the basement of the tabernacle when he was 8, but didn't go much to church after that. And so he has to be ordained to priesthood, starts paying his tithing again, reactivated, so to speak. And then eventually they moved to Pocatello.
Around the time I was 5 years old, we moved into a home that my parents built in Alameda, which was adjacent to Pocatello, on 1069 Spruce Street. And that's where we lived for the next 20 years until they moved to Portland, Oregon. There are a lot of great memories of that home and being there with my parents.
She was the primary president for a while, and then she served as a young women's leader. We remember that was when we were at home in Pocatello, and the young women all loved Ida.
My father was born on what we now celebrate as Memorial Day, May 30th. My mother was born on November 11th, which is the Veterans Day, Armistice Day that we celebrate. And their favorite holiday was the 4th of July. Every summer he would go over to Wyoming and buy fireworks that were much more powerful than what you could buy in Idaho. So he'd make a special trip over to Wyoming, maybe attached with a business trip, buy his fireworks and come back. And so virtually every holiday we would go outside and blow off our firecrackers, and the 4th of July was a spectacular day with lots of pancake breakfasts and those kind of things.
My dad had a very set agenda for family home evening. It began with a prayer. We would always pledge allegiance to the flag. We would stand and face the flag, say the Pledge of Allegiance. My dad was a World War II veteran and a real patriotic American, and he believed that was an important part of family home evening. The very end of it was perhaps the best part, and it was singing a song from the old recreational songbook that the church published during that era. It was a song called Walking at Night. It begins with this sweet lullaby, walking at night along the meadow way, home from the dance beside my maiden gay. And then it kind of repeats that. And then at the end of that, it goes, hey, and it turns into a German beer drinking song. Stodala, 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 pampa, stodala, pampa, stodala, pampa, stodala, 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 pampa, stodala, pampa, pum, pum, pum. And of course, we're all in a full-throated shout by the end of that song. It was quite a memorable ending to family home evening. We would then have a prayer and go to bed. We lived just 6 houses away from the elementary school, so it was easy to come home for lunch. My dad would come home for lunch, so the whole family was there.
I vividly remember being downstairs on 1069 Spruce Street, and we had a ping pong table, and it was really a big part of what happened in kind of the family area downstairs. There was just a ton of laughter and camaraderie. We had playing in the basement as a family, and a lot of that was playing ping pong.
Around the time I was about 6 years old, we went to the Idaho Falls Temple and were sealed as a family. When I was 7 years old, Pam and Mary and I were the 3 children who were sealed to my parents at that time. Dow and Stan had not yet arrived on the scene.
So when I was 12 years old, in the church, at least in my ward, the beehives collected fast offerings. I remember stopping in front of that first house and Dad just turning to me. I had the fast offering envelope in my hand, and I was a bundle of nerves. He just empowered me. You know, he was a great salesman. You just march up those steps, you square your shoulders and look them in the eye and give them your biggest smile and say, I'm here to collect fast offerings.
When I was young, he came home one day and said, there's a National Boy Scout Jamboree in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and you can earn half the money by selling tins of Catherine Bike candy. This was candy the Boy Scouts made available, kind of like the Girl Scouts do with their cookies. He said, you go up to the door, you put a smile on your face, you introduce yourself, you tell them who you are, you tell them why you are selling the candy to go to the National Jamboree. You tell them it's a good product and that you would love it if they would help support you and buy some. And then he said, you ask for the sale. Will you buy some candy? Then he said, don't say another word. And it worked beautifully.
He believed in us, but he didn't just believe in us. He invested in us. He taught us. He showed us.
I have a little bit of an interest in art. When I was a little kid, I drew on everything. When I got to college, I wasn't sure what to major in, and I ended up in an art-related field of interior design. I think Dad was the one that really helped me determine where my path should go.
I was called as my dad's home teaching companion when I was probably 14, thereabout. We went to visit a family that was inactive. They were an older couple. The first time we visited, they kept the television on while we were there. That was a clear message. They really didn't want us there. We walked out of there and I thought, why are we wasting our time doing this? Well, we went back a second or third time, and while we were there, my dad looked through a picture window into their backyard and could see they had a beautiful garden growing. He asked them what they were growing in the backyard. Would they mind showing him their garden? When he asked that question, I could just see things change. I could just see the dynamic change. They realized he had genuine interest in them and that he wasn't going away. And they took us out in the backyard and they walked us through this lovely garden. It was very impressive. And that was a change which led to them becoming active in the ward.
We traveled a little bit. Some of our favorite spots were up to Jackson Hole and Yellowstone.
My father loved to spend time with the family on vacations. And so every summer we would go to Yellowstone National Park, or we would go to Sun Valley, Idaho, which was perhaps his favorite vacation place.
In a lot of ways, our parents, Mom and Dad, had two families. There was the oldest three kids. There was at least one miscarriage in a period of time where they couldn't have children. And so there's 5.5+ years between Mary and me. So I've always kind of joked, there was the older three kids and the younger two kids. The older three kids got all Mom and Dad's discipline, and so they're talented. Stan and I, we got all Mom's love, so we're secure.
My parents had a second room off of their master room that was a piano room. And so my mom would be teaching lessons when Dow and I would go in and practice. And that practicing was either playing chess or playing a game where we were throwing checkers pieces at each other. Very seldom was it anything related to touching the actual piano. And so that we ended up with no talent and no experience to be able to say we could play the piano. But I took piano lessons for 8 years, and I think I got to level 2.
Because of her love of music, when I was a teenager and a little bit better at piano, I liked it more. And then she taught me and some other friends how to do the organ, basic organ things, so we could play for the last hymn of church.
Effie, her mother told Ida, you practice the piano and I will sew your clothes for you. So Ida wanted her daughters to learn how to sew. So I was involved. It was really nice. I had friends in my neighborhood in my 4-H group, and I learned how to sew and cook. And therefore I didn't become the pianist my mother did. My mother was.
My dad was a consummate do-gooder. And honestly, when I think back, my mom was really the consummate do-gooder. She was so interested in helping and serving others. She accepted every assignment to play the piano, to play the organ for all the weddings and the funerals, and she was always willing. And it wasn't just music. She, you know, if you needed something, you could ask Ida, and she would do it.
She had to organize, communicate, help people figure things out, especially when it came to weddings and funerals. She was often the one that would help these people. She'd done so many of them that she would help them say, well, yeah, the bride comes in here, the groom here, and I play this music here, and you do this. So it was very interesting over the years watching her do that. And I don't ever recall her saying no to an opportunity to help people.
One Saturday morning, we had a luncheon at the Federal Heights Ward where I grew up. And my Aunt Ida and Mary happened to be in town. We went to the luncheon, and there was excitement because there was going to be a program where a lady in the Salt Lake Valley area was going to put on a mini musical. And I think the musical was supposed to be Oklahoma, but apparently that's not what happened. The musical music and the costumes that came were from The Sound of Music. The lady that was supposed to be the accompanist ended up not showing up. We sat and waited, and after about a half an hour period, there was obviously a problem. The lady that was in charge started to talk to someone, and my mother, who was Ida's sister, was right there and said, hey, you know, are you looking for an accompanist? My sister could play that music for you. And my mother had enough confidence in Ida's musical ability and sight reading ability that she knew that her sister could sit down and play cold whatever music was needed. And so the program proceeded, and Ida sat down and played the music for the program. And I just remember being really proud of my Aunt Ida that day because she played what I thought was the music flawlessly. And I was just really proud of her. My mother had always been the little sister who never kind of practiced like Ida did. And so my mother played the piano and the organ, but she wasn't like Ida. And I was just really thankful that my aunt, who was visiting our ward that day, could be the one to pinch hit and sit down and save the day.
Growing up, I think Stan and I played golf with Mom almost every week. Stan had a hole-in-one on a par 3 on Renko Golf Course. Mom and her group were just in front of Stan. He was playing by himself, and he hits this 3-wood on this long par 3, and it goes in the hole, the only hole-in-one in the family. Mom got to witness.
I always thought it was really cool that Grandma was out there swinging the clubs.
I was totally a tomboy growing up. Loved sports, everything about them. And Grandma, who I never gave her that label, right? Let's go back to the clothes and jewelry and accessories. Grandma always looked great and was in a skirt. And even in that photo, she's in her dress, probably after church, helping me hit a wiffle ball. And she's the one that she had golf clubs hanging in her garage. She played golf, and now I play golf.
I actually inherited one of her golf clubs. I think I still have it in my golf bag.
George taught himself to play tennis on the public courts near his house and up on the avenues in Salt Lake City. And the story goes, once upon a time, he injured his right wrist and he learned to play left-handed. My dad was always encouraging me to play tennis. They sent me to a couple of tournaments. I did local tournaments, then I played a couple of out-of-state tournaments in Utah and Colorado. Just great memories. There was a reservoir right next to their house in Portland, and we would play tennis on the reservoir. But this tradition has passed down, especially into Larry's family and mine. All of our children, we have 4, they all played tennis throughout their lives.
Yeah, I remember at Grandma and Grandpa's house, it's kind of funny thinking back, they lived on this little hill, and then there was a little land, and there was this random tennis court right next to their house. But we used to play on that thing all the time.
That was one thing I always associated with Grandma and Grandpa. And then they would come, she would come to all my soccer games and basketball games and was always there. So I guess I just always knew she cared about sports, and then obviously passed on through my dad.
In our little house in Pocatello, Idaho, you'd walk in the front door, and the coat closet was adjacent to the front door, perpendicular to it. And every time that I either was coming in or leaving, when he was with me, coming in from church, for instance, or leaving for church, he always helped me on with my coat without me realizing it until many decades later. That very simple, small act of kindness taught me that I was important. There was something about me that was worth something for someone to do that for. I used to think that my dad tucked us in at night, but truthfully, now I say they both tucked us in. And I think that the long-term impact of both their efforts was important. My mom would play, she'd practice the piano while Dad would tuck us in. And he would always sit on the side of my bed. He taught me how to pray. He taught me the articles of faith. I could ask him questions. I remember asking him about the bishopric. I thought it was a brick.
But I have read in my mother's journal here where her mother said that George was 1 in a million. This is my mom quoting in her journal. So Effie felt strongly that George was a great husband. And Ida says, and I wholeheartedly agree. We had a wonderful time together each day and look forward to being together at the end of each day.
My father adored my mother. My father adored his mother. And I think that carried over so much to the way he treated his spouse.
He was the appreciator. Whenever we had company in the home, he would ask my mother to play. Just when everyday company would come, Ida, would you sit down and play? So that's the way I thought he showed great love and appreciation for her music skills.
So when I think about my mom and how best to articulate who she was an incredible woman. And I think my dad in his journal describes it best. And we're going to have Ben and Lisa read from the journals now.
She had a purity about her in 1946, which attracted me and which is still an inspiration. She is steady, slow to anger. The children might challenge this, but I do not recall her ever raising her voice in anger of something they did or did not. She is sensitive to the needs of those about her and responsive to those needs. Finally, she has no facade, no guile, no false pretense.
Ida's children should know of some of the reasons that I fell in love with her in the first place and love her even more now. Her enthusiasm, her good cheer, her remarkable talents as a mate, a neighbor, a friend, a mother. Her understanding, her boundless energy. She takes a lot of kidding at the end of the day when, the very moment she sits down, she dozes off to sleep. However, the mightiest power sources need recharging. Ida is an accomplished professional musician of the first order. The manner in which she shares that talent is a source of joy to me and probably a source of great personal satisfaction to her. Though she is a splendid soloist or accompanist, she is a sensation as a teacher. Not just a piano teacher, an inspirer, a demanding driver, a concerned friend and confidant to all her students. Their reverence for her and their enthusiasm for their mutual training is a tribute.
So Dad was given the opportunity to become the sales manager of the Paul Roberts Company and then the general manager of the Paul Roberts Company, which was the person in charge of the entire company reporting to Paul and Marion Roberts. Paul Roberts had serious health issues. He passed away. Marion took over the business. Dad developed a very close relationship with her, and she became a very strong supporter of his, and he did of hers. When her husband died, she just went through a period of almost uncontrollable grief for a few years, and Dad helped keep her glued together. They became very fast friends. She loved my father and admired my father so much that she talked to someone at work around the time I was graduating from high school and getting ready to go on a mission. She asked this person what she could do to help George. And this friend said, well, Larry's leaving on a mission. You could offer to pay for his mission. And she did. So that's the kind of respect she had for my dad.
Somewhere 1968, 1969, Dad thinks the world is better than the church.
My dad, for reasons that I'm not sure he fully understood, started having some problems keeping the word of wisdom about the time I was 17 or 18 years old. I didn't realize it was going on until I came home from college my freshman year, was ready to go on a mission, and learned that my parents could not go with me to the Idaho Falls Temple to receive my own endowment. That was very painful news, very discouraging. I couldn't imagine why.
I think he had had some habits. His dad was an alcoholic. I think he struggled with some addiction. He smoked and drank during the war, and he had gotten rid of those habits in Twin Falls, and had worked hard at that. But then when they moved to Pocatello, it came back. I remember as a young boy gathering around Mom's needlepoint piano bench and having family prayer morning and night. And then somewhere, 67, 68, 69, somewhere in there, that stopped. And for Stan and me, church was truly optional. Mom and Dad encouraged us to go, and they went. But I think if we had pushed back, they'd have rolled over. They'd have totally rolled over. So, Mom and Dad were funny. They had in Idaho, I remember there was a little closet in the kitchen, cabinet in the kitchen pantry that had, red wine and cranberry juice. So I think they thought we couldn't tell the difference. They put cranberry juice in our glasses and red wine in their glasses.
I would type up little notes on the typewriter and have like little quotes from the Doctrine and Covenants, section 89. And I would tape them on the coffee pot or on those bottles, and my sister did the same thing.
So one time during this period, I was at home. I had early release. I didn't think Mom was at home. So she came in later somehow, and she didn't know I was home. And in their bedroom on the old rotary phone, the phone rings, and it's Mom and Dad talking. And, our mom was never kind of an aggressive, in-your-face, that day on the phone, she confronted Dad about Dad's smoking habit, Dad's drinking habits, and Jerry, you gotta give it up, and you gotta do it today. And she kind of let him have it on the phone. I was in my bedroom. I had kind of heard her come in, and I was like, I'm asleep. I'm not gonna tell Mom I'm home. So I'm just staying there in bed, and then the phone rings, and this conversation happens. It's like, now I got to stay asleep. But of course, I was listening on the edge of my bed. Go Mom, go Mom.
My first year at BYU, I started BYU in 1972. Came home that Christmas. And I had an accident, actually doing inventory down at my dad's steel and industrial supplies store. Hurt my knee. They took me to the emergency room. There was a lot of blood under my kneecap. And anyway, so later on that night, I'm kind of laid up in bed. I go to bed and I can't sleep. I actually was in a lot of pain. And about 4 a.m, I decided that I just couldn't deal with this anymore. So I called to my dad, and I wondered if he would give me a blessing. Now, I well knew that my dad was struggling with some things in his life at that point. I asked him anyway. So he left my room. He went back to his room, and it was a while before he came back to my room. This was in Pocatello, Idaho. And he had put on his Sunday clothes, and he had taken some time in private prayer. And I wonder what he said in that prayer. But he gave me a blessing. And it was shortly after that I fell asleep. And many hours later, woke up and felt that I had experienced a personal miracle.
And from the time I left home as a freshman in college, I was hardly home after that except for a week or two. I was at Harvard, then I was in Brazil for 2 years, came back, was home for a week or two, worked in Salt Lake, worked in Minneapolis, followed that pattern the next several years, got married, went off to graduate school in California. And so I was never really around during the detour they took where they weren't as fully active as they had been. And my dad struggled with word of wisdom issues, did not pay his tithing, and really took a step back in terms of their activity in the church.
In this period, 1969 to 1977, he talks about it specifically in his journal, and I quote from his journal, it says, "The Lord moved us to Oregon in 1974 to humble me and to bring me to my senses."
My mother played a pivotal role in helping our family return to the gospel path. So my mother was the one who really was the prime mover that has enabled the gospel to influence me and my children and grandchildren, and each of my siblings and their children and grandchildren. There's a wonderful passage in Isaiah, chapter 58, verse 12, where Isaiah talks about those who are repairers of the breach and restorers of the paths to dwell in. My mother was the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the paths to dwell in. And I am so grateful to her for that. Who knows what would have happened had she not taken the initiative when she did. But because she took the initiative when she did, we had the gospel in our home starting when I was 5 years old. And that became the most powerful influence in my life and the lives of my siblings and my children.
But there was kind of this, elephant in the room that we all sort of knew about, that we didn't talk about.
1977, I was in my bedroom. I was a senior in high school. It was nighttime. Pam was not living at home. And she was coming home to tell Mom and Dad that she was falling in love with Jason, that they were going to get married. So Pam, I think she knew at some level that Mom and Dad were doing better, but I don't think she knew the full context of their kind of trajectory.
They really got some support from some excellent people there, some home teachers who got them more engaged at church. And then Jason and I had the idea to get married in April of 1977, and we approached my parents, and they said, yes, we will go with you. And we were in shock.
And I was minding my own business in my bedroom. They were talking in the just down the hall in the living room. They were talking about Pam wanting to marry Jason. And when Pam asked them, could you go through the temple with us? Mom and Dad said, yes. And there was this kind of visceral, joyful sound. It wasn't a scream, but it was a joyful noise, I guess, from Pam, because her parents could go through the temple with her.
Well, this was very meaningful for me because Pam got married first. And it meant that my parents could be at my wedding and my endowment. And so that was a really beautiful summer for our family. Some really big, important events occurred in 1977. And I'm really thankful to Pam for doing that.
That was kind of the beginning of the rest of their life. Dad is reconverted to the church and comes back with a vengeance.
So from that point forward, I'm not sure you would have recognized them as the same people.
When we moved to Oregon, I remember vividly an immediate uptick in our time spent participating in Sunday worship, full activity, and all that entails.
In fact, Stan tells a story when Dad and Mom are kind of coming back and they want to have family prayer. Stan was like, and me as well, was, what's that? What are we doing that for? We don't need to do that. That's okay. That's for somebody else. And because it was just, we hadn't seen it for almost a decade.
I think it was a huge relief to my mom. I think she always wanted to be, as a team, fully invested, and I think it was a delight to her.
My dad was, again, fully active in the gospel. He was the bishop, a patriarch, a sealer in the temple. My mother was an ordinance worker and shift supervisor in the temple.
Another big responsibility she had was when she was serving as a temple worker in the Portland temple, she was a shift coordinator. We know what a significant responsibility that is.
In September of 1980, George Wilson was called to be the bishop of the West Hills Ward in the Beaverton Stake. In September of 1986, I was called to be a bishop. And one of the things that George did was he wrote me a letter of advice. You will receive adulation and praise from ward members, sometimes to your embarrassment. Remember, their praise is largely directed to the bishop and the office he represents, not to Jason Carlisle. And one other piece of advice he gave me was, love the saints, encourage them, praise them, and make your ward the most active ward in the church. It will grow, inactives will be active, and you will have your own Zion. I've followed his several pieces of counsel as best I could in my own way. But later on in life, I became a stake president. I called 24 bishops and branch presidents during my tenure. And every one of those bishops and branch presidents got a copy of George Wilson's advice to me. So his legacy of kindness and service continues to live and lived way beyond his life in the Lebanon, Oregon stake.
My father did a remarkable thing. He broke a generational pattern. It would have been easy for him to follow the pattern he'd seen with his father and to become a victim to demon rum. And with his detour away from the church for a period of time, close to a decade, perhaps he was on thin ice in terms of where that could have led. Now, alcohol never became a problem for him in terms of what occurred with his father, but he made the decision finally to get that completely out of his life, which he did. And I give my father great credit for breaking that generational pattern. He had a terrible relationship with his father. He had a great relationship with his children. That's a hard thing to do, but he did it. And I admire him tremendously for it.
So in 1977 is when Dad completed his autobiography. And again, I think that was kind of a culminating event for him in terms of bringing himself to fully repent and be prepared to be on that covenant path. So he wrote this Real George, which we've talked about, and he then wrote in 9 journals over the next 20 years. When I read Dad's journals, I know how much love he had for his family and how he's such a great writer.
Now, his writing, of course, is spectacular, and the thing that I love about it the most is it's so authentic and so conversational. And, you know, to hear the narrative George Wilson in word is to hear George Wilson. And, you know, I love the title he picked for his book, The Real George, you know, because that's who it is in there. It's how he talked.
And he described with emotion all those things so well in these 9 journals. And I'm grateful for him and for the ability he had to continue on that journey to write his feelings in his journal. And I think he wants all of us, his posterity, to be doing the same thing.
And then, of course, in the community, it was amazing. Our sister Mary almost died as a child, was benefited from a blood transfusion. But Dad gave pretty much the maximum amount of blood that you could give over the course of his life. Gallons and gallons of blood. And then, on top of that, he went to work as a volunteer leader to ask people for money and for blood for the YMCA blood drive. And he was extraordinarily committed in that way.
So I was serving my mission and had 1 week left on my mission. So I got this notice from my mission president to call him a week before my mission ended. And they told me that my dad had had a heart attack and they weren't sure he was going to survive.
His heart attack was when he was at work in Northwest Portland. And more or less his coworkers got him to the Good Samaritan Hospital. We were in Albany, so we were about an hour south of where they lived. They had just come out with that drug that they shoot up through the veins to clear the blockages. He was one of the first to get that.
After he had his heart attack, he was very involved with the YMCA heart program. I'm not sure what the exact title was, but he ended up becoming one of their leading fundraisers to help fund their program to help victims of heart disease.
He lived 15 to 17 years after his heart attack.
And I remember at the time, so I was probably about 12, I had a bullseye dyed, bleached into my hair.
Evan had Evan was into FOF back then, and he had this target that was dyed on his head. And anyway, it was that phase of Wilson Cousins.
And I'm sure, thinking back, now that I'm so old and wise, that Grandpa did not love all of those hairstyles, but he never once said anything. He was always, he always had the warmest smile, very welcoming, and he wanted to make sure that you were doing okay. And I remember that in the last couple of years too, even when he had slowed down, he was always asking about you when he obviously was in tough shape.
But I remember I must have been in high school when he had his first stroke. And that was when I remember things really changing. And actually, he had given me, so he was a patriarch there in Portland, and he had actually given me my patriarchal blessing. I think it was a week or two before he had his stroke.
But I know that once he had the stroke, we went to the hospital a lot, and I remember him just having really good humor. He was paralyzed on half of his face. He couldn't move much. And so he would teach us finger exercises. We always, in our family, have done opening exercises that were actual exercises, like you're doing push-ups. And so, which was confusing later as a youth when opening exercises were not actually exercises.
One vivid memory that I have of her is how she cared for Grandpa Wilson after his stroke. And we would often go visit Grandpa and Grammy's house for Christmas. And we would kind of come back from Europe for a period of time.
He had my mom had taken care of him for a while, and she explains in her journal how she liked doing that even though it was hard. And then she had a young lady, Juliana, come to the house to help her. And then at some point, he moved to another care home.
He was suffering a lot, and he wanted to get to the 50th anniversary of their marriage, and he did.
And at that point, he was in a wheelchair, and I think he told us, the family, that he was living to celebrate that 50th wedding anniversary.
So for their 50th wedding anniversary, they had this bash in the West Hills ward.
And it was wonderful. They had a little reception, and all the family gathered, had pictures, had the reception with all the friends.
One of my takeaways from that is just the fragile condition that my dad appeared to be in.
On his deathbed, he had all of his children and almost all of his grandchildren gathered around him. And we gave him a priesthood blessing.
I was probably the youngest grandchild who was invited in to see him before he passed away. And I actually remember what he said. He talked about not deceiving yourself.
And he said to all of us, never deceive yourselves. And he repeated it several times.
And I guess what it means for me now is to always make sure that I'm checking back with the source of truth, to stay connected to God and to Jesus Christ.
And I think his message was, I deceived myself for a while. I feel bad about that. I've repented of that. I don't know how the Lord's going to take care of that. I could have done better. I should have done better.
But he did not want us to make that kind of detour. And I have felt strongly in my life that I wanted to faithfully remain on the gospel path.
It helps me to check myself and not just get too, I guess, maybe fast in my opinions, to really think about, do I have the real truth? Am I really looking at what's real?
He knew what was right, and he deceived himself really with the worldly challenges that exist in our world today, just as much as they did back then.
Those words from my dad were timely when he passed away almost 20 years ago, and they're timely now.
And so all of a sudden, these things that he had taken care of their whole life, like a lot of, bills or things like that, I think it was an adjustment because she had just been with him for her whole life.
This is my mother's entry from May 3rd, 1998. Today is one big day for me. I just returned from choir practice where I played for Terry McNeil so she could go to her granddaughter's blessing. Also, I am playing at church for her and in Relief Society. I miss George so very much, and it is difficult not to have him here for today.
My dad, I think, knowing that his health was not good, told Bishop Bear that he wanted him to promise that he would take care of Ida after my dad passed away. So now fast forward, they need a new Relief Society president in the ward. Bishop Bear is bishop, my dad's passed away. And Bishop Bear goes to the coast with his wife, Linda. And while he's out walking on the beach, he starts thinking about this, and he starts focusing really a lot on this new Relief Society president and who it should be. And then, while he's thinking about that, into his mind, I don't know if the voice came to his mind or if he heard the voice, but my dad said, "What about Ida?"
I miss George so very much, and it is difficult not to have him here for today. I will be presented to the congregation for serving as the West Hills Ward Relief Society president today on Fast Sunday. I have prayed fervently this week in preparation for the day and pray for added strength, energy, and understanding at this time. It is a pretty amazing undertaking. And I pray I may serve well and give the sisters all that I can to help them in any way.
She was just so loving. And when she was the Relief Society president, it was so fun to watch how influential she was. She had spent so many years in music and displaying her love through music. But now people saw how much love she had to give and how willing she was to give it in those callings, those service opportunities.
She was always seemed to be happy and smiling. And I remember her saying, "Thanks a million," all the time. That was kind of the phrase I think that I would most closely associate with Grandma was "Thanks a million."
I feel like Grandma was an amazing example of always being present. Grandma and Grandpa were never not there. Birthdays, holidays, sporting events, baptisms.
And she took me to soccer sometimes. I remember sleeping over at her house a lot, even with friends. She would let my friends sleep over. And once we went to her perm appointment, and I remember being overwhelmed and a little sick after being with her when she got her hair permed.
That I was also always, as a kid, very intrigued by my grandma's hair. We always had this pick with her, and she would always want us to, when we were driving, she'd be in the front or we'd be riding in the back. She would always say, "Can you fix my hair in the back? And can you puff it up?" And she would always want us to kind of help fix her hair. As she was, especially, she's like, "I need to get in for my appointment, so I need you to help me get my hair fluffed up until I can get into my next appointment."
One of my clear memories was of her wig that she would wear, and my nieces that are twins were little, they would put it on and dress up in Grandma's wig.
When her health kind of went bad, she moved into, I think it was called Springville, which was an assisted living home.
She was definitely starting to fade at the end, but mentally she was so there.
And one of the memories I do have is that we would go and play Uno Attack with her. I don't know why she loved Uno Attack, but that was the game she wanted to play.
She was hitting that Uno Attack thing like no one's business.
And it always seemed like she was really happy there, which was cool.
When we were growing up in Pocatello, she was president of the Pocatello Music Club from 1965 to 1966. Mom was not a shrinking violet. She was on the stage performing a lot in the spotlight. In order to be a leader in music, you have to communicate with people a lot. It's often the accompanist who helps organize the musical number. What are we going to work on this part of the music? What are we going to do here? Where are we going to stand? And how are we going to present ourselves? And I have a binder of newspaper articles where they had events, they had teas, they had fundraisers, they had performances that involves the schools. And she was involved in all of that as well as performing.
I lived with her when I worked like half a year in college. I grew up remembering watching her perform piano performance And I mean, it was, maybe she was not technically a professional, but it was professional level piano performance.
All along while doing this, she was a private piano teacher in her home while raising 5 children in Pocatello, and then she continued in Portland. I know many of those parents of those people, and I've had association. Those people just say your mother was the greatest piano teacher, and she had recitals of her own students in the home.
And it kind of reminded me of like a working mother. I mean, she was running piano lessons in her home. I went to a number of those recitals growing up.
She managed that business, and I just realized over the years what a significant responsibility and job that was. But she loved it because she loved the music.
She actually passed away too when I was away serving a mission out of the country. And I remember that was a tough experience for me because I don't know, there's something about being young and grandma and grandpa are always there, and then you go on a mission and they're not. And it just, those, just some of the closure and not being there, that was just kind of an odd experience for me. And I've often thought about that and how that was tough.
And I remember just my mom and how hard it was. I remember actually I got to speak on the phone to her as she was passing. And she was just kind of moaning on the other end. And I just told her how much I loved her. You know, just you could feel a worry. I think she was just worried about those she was leaving behind. But it provided closure for me. I remember I ran out of my office at work at GE and was sitting in my car having this moment with my grandma that, you know, you're never really prepared to, but it's something I'm very grateful I got to do to this day.
I think, you know, looking back and thinking about her life, there were ups and downs like we all have, but I feel like she was just that steady ship, even when the winds were strong, and she really grounded her family.
I'm sure her biggest influence on me had to do with music, the richness that there is in music and that it can bless lives, whether it's intentional or not, whether it's individual or to a huge group of people, that there's power in music, and that if you have those gifts, you should share them and share them freely.
He was my mom's best cheerleader, and he was probably my best cheerleader too.
I think his influence on me would, for one, it taught me self-respect. He gave me a desire to lend myself to the world, to share the talents that I had. He always said, where much is given, much is expected.
He reached out to people of all stations in life. Spread your wings, get out there, take advantage of an opportunity.
So if I were to tell my kids what my grandpa and grandma Wilson were like, I would tell them that they were just the most loving, wonderful people who were invested, and who, to them, family was the most important thing in the world. And they wanted to make their family a place where everyone felt love and felt seen and felt tight-knit. Even though we lived a lot of places all over the world, they managed to help us feel like we were really important because we were part of their family.
They had this ability to gather people, bring people together. They were always welcoming people into their home, and I hope that my family carries on that tradition of being gatherers.
You know, when I tell people this is my third cousin once removed, they're like, what? You even know who your third cousin once removed is? Well, yeah, don't you?
There would be some Sundays where my grandma Faye and our family and Ida's family would drive to Maddox up in Brigham City because it was a halfway point between Salt Lake and Pocatello. And we would have Sunday dinner together. And it was a way that we were all able to get together as a family.
So I know that both my mom and Ida, they've built these strong Wilson and Young roots in us, and it's given me the confidence to know that I can tackle whatever hardship might lie in front of me.
But I think what I've learned overall from her is that as a leader, the traits of humility, compassion, love, and the ability to communicate are what stand out to me.
I would love my children and my grandchildren. I wish they could have known my dad. I would want them to know just how much he loved them. Family was everything to Dad. And that's what he'd want his children and grandchildren to know, is just how committed he was to them. He got to give many of his grandchildren patriarchal blessings. What a thrill for him to do that. I wish all my kids could have had that experience with him. But wow, he really wanted to be a force in their life and have a relationship with them and know that the gospel's true and that it's worth everything.
They would both be so happy to hear that all 25 of their 25 grandchildren are now endowed in the temple. 23 of the 23 children married have been married, and their marriage has been sealed in the temple. 18 of their grandchildren have been on missions. All of their grandsons have been on missions. What a great legacy that is. And now this family, these choices that they've made, there's now 120 members of the family, 62 great-grandchildren that they now have. I'm sure that they are just so joyous as they see this unfolding and seeing that the choices that they made have influenced so many lives in so many positive ways.
And one of the amazing things about mom and dad's marriage, of course, is they brought a ton to each other. And you see that in the generations that have happened. When I think about Linda, Jason, Mike, Lynn, and Roz, they all brought a ton to our family. And now you look at the next generation and what they're bringing in the way of in-laws and the qualities and the skills. And I know that my parents would just love every one of them to death. And of course, that's what they do for us. They make the family better, and we're so glad to have them part of us.
I believe that he would want his grandchildren to know that he believed and had a firm testimony of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, that above all, he strove to be a disciple of Christ. And he believed that the only path to happiness was in coming to embrace the message of Christ and to follow him. And I think my dad traveled a variety of different paths in life, not just the one that leads to Christ, but other paths as well. And from his own experience, he knew that there was only one way to find true happiness, and that was to come to the Savior and to follow him and to receive all the blessings that he has to offer. I know that he had a very firm, strong testimony of the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ through the prophet Joseph Smith. We in our family are part of the Smith family. Joseph's cousin, George A. Smith, was one of the early apostles, and that was a great source of pride to my father, to his parents, to all of the ones prior to him, going back to George A. Smith. And I hold John Smith and Clarissa, his wife, in equally high regard. They were the first ones to embrace the gospel, and their son George A. followed and became an apostle and a counselor in the first presidency to Brigham Young. So I think my father would also want his posterity to know that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the true and living church of God upon the earth today. And it is the path that leads back to our heavenly home.
Hey, Mom, we'd really like to thank you for your role as a leader and in our home, and a musician, and a leader in the community, in the church, and in so many different ways. It's helped all of us in our lives to be better leaders, be better people, and to serve those around us. Thanks so much. Love you, Mom.